In this video, I'll share the visual design concepts I wish I knew earlier. I'll also include a reference guide in the description that reminds you of all the strategies I'll talk about in the video. The concepts in this video apply to any kind of visual art, from UI to character design, and even full art pieces. If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, I'd appreciate a comment about which concepts you'd like to try next. Let's start with contrast. Just about every single decision about visual design relates to contrast in some way. In simplified terms, contrast describes differences in elements. Lots of contrast means they look very different, and low contrast means they look similar. We subconsciously draw connections between elements that have low relative contrast. Our brains think, if they look the same, they must be connected. When elements have high relative contrast, our brains decide which one jumps out at us based on color, size, and shape. So, high contrast is useful for making something stand out, and low contrast is useful for connecting elements. The most simple ways to control contrast are changing size and color, but all of the concepts I'll talk about from here on can actually be used to adjust the contrast. Let's start with color. Color has three properties, each of which can be used for different purposes. Saturation describes how vibrant a color is, or how close it is to being grayscale. Low saturations can be used to create subtle elements that don't stand out. High saturations can be used to emphasize elements via contrast, or give stronger colors to entire scenes. Value describes brightness of a color from dark to light. Value has a huge impact on the mood. Dark scenes have low energy, and light scenes have high energy. Value can also be used to match the emotion you're trying to express. Hue describes the placement of the color on the color wheel. Different hues have different meanings, which are also influenced by culture. Warm colors like red and yellow tend to express urgency, whereas cool colors like blue and purple tend to express calm. The more intentional that the choice of hue appears to be, the more the viewer will read into the meanings behind those hues. All three of the properties of color can be used to control contrast, including saturation, value, and hue. And they can be used in interesting combinations too. But as images aren't usually made of flat colors, that brings us to our next topic, textures. Texture describe what fills the shapes in an image. Dense textures with high levels of detail tend to express realism, whereas simple textures tend to bring the focus to ideas. It can be said that there is a spectrum from conceptual to realistic. What I like about this idea is that even if you can't draw, you can still express ideas and concepts in the most effective way with visuals. Because the simpler the image is, the easier it is for us to quickly understand. You can also remove texture altogether to create something called a silhouette. Since silhouettes become simpler by removing the texture, they can also be used to express concepts without distracting from other elements. Artists and animators tend to use silhouettes to create elements that don't steal the show, but still express complex ideas by using texture contrast. Textures can also create mesmerizing effects through repetitive textures. Textures like these are harder to look away from because they're interesting and curious. Which brings us to the next topic, repetition. I like to think of repetition in two ways: explicit repetition, where elements are copied or repeated, and implicit repetition, where visual design choices are repeated instead of entire elements. Explicit repetition can be used in storytelling by repeating visual symbols, grouping elements into a whole like a crowd of people, or to draw connections between otherwise different elements. Implicit repetition can make designs feel more cohesive by repeating colors, textures, or other visual choices. It is seen most obviously in graphic designs like main menus and UI. Repetition can also be used to make elements stand out through contrast. Spikes in video games are a good example of this. They are the only element that has a repetitive pattern, so it contrasts from everything else. But there's another reason spikes stand out, which brings us to our next topic, shape. Shapes carry different meanings and can be used to give character to elements. Sharp shapes with exaggerated edges express a sense of danger or power. Round, soft shapes tend to express kindness or safety. The physical stability of a shape also impacts how it is perceived. Unstable shapes can seem silly or express potential for danger. Stable shapes can express reliability or strength. But shape can also be used in our next topic, typefaces. I like to split typefaces into three main categories based on their usage: readable fonts, decorative fonts, and written fonts. Readable fonts include serif fonts, sans serif fonts, and any other fonts that are designed to be easily read. These fonts are mandatory for large blocks of text because of how annoying it is to try and read other fonts in large amounts. Readable fonts can still have personality, but not as much as decorative fonts. Decorative fonts are useful for bringing attention to text by making the text itself visually appealing. Decorative fonts can add a huge amount of character to a design and can make UI or marketing stand out because of the amount of effort it takes to find the perfect font. But unlike readable fonts, decorative fonts don't have strict rules to follow, so they can be created with full artistic freedom. Written fonts look intentionally like they were written by hand. This includes printed writing and cursive writing. Written fonts express intentionality in the message being written. It's almost as if the letters were written for us, and we tend to read it with more consideration. Don't forget to leave a comment about the visual design concepts you'd like to use. Thanks for watching.